The mysterious visitor. The night air was crisp as Ethan sat on the porch of his secluded cabin, sipping hot cocoa. Nestled deep in the Appalachian woods, he preferred the solitude, a reprieve from the chaos of city life. His dog, Rusty, a loyal and energetic golden retriever, sat beside him, his ears perked up and eyes scanning the tree line. Rusty suddenly stood, tail stiff, and let out a low growl. Ethan turned his head, setting his mug down. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Rusty bolted off the porch before he could finish. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, his heart quickening. It wasn't unusual for Rusty to chase rabbits, but something about this felt different. Following Rusty into the woods, Ethan called out, his voice echoing into the trees. "Rusty! Come back!" The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of the dog darting ahead. Finally, Rusty stopped, barking excitedly at something lying on the ground. Ethan approached cautiously, his pulse racing. A figure lay crumpled beneath the canopy of trees. It was a girl, her skin pale and shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Her silver hair glistened as if dusted with stars. She wore a strange, iridescent garment that clung to her slender frame. In her hand was an object unlike anything Ethan had seen, sleek, metallic, and glowing faintly with a soft blue hue. Ethan crouched beside her, his instincts torn between caution and compassion. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. She didn't respond, her eyes fluttering open briefly before she passed out again. Rusty nudged her hand with his nose, whimpering softly. Without a second thought, Ethan carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost too light. Rusty trotted beside him as he carried her back to the cabin, questions swirling in his mind. Who was she? What was she doing here in the middle of nowhere? Inside the cabin, Ethan laid her gently on the couch and covered her with a blanket. Rusty sat nearby, watching her with a curious yet protective gaze. Ethan examined the strange object she clutched. It was warm to the touch and emitted a faint hum, like machinery quietly humming to life. He decided not to tamper with it and placed it on the table. Hours passed, and Ethan dozed off in the armchair opposite the couch. He woke to the sound of movement and found her sitting up, her luminous eyes scanning the room with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ethan raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Hey, you're safe here," he said gently. She tilted her head, not understanding his words. Instead, she pointed to herself and made a sound, soft, melodic, and utterly alien. Ethan tried to mimic her sound, and she smiled faintly. Then she pointed at him, her expression expectant. "Ethan," he said, tapping his chest. She repeated his name, her voice wrapping around the syllables like a song. She then gestured toward Rusty, who wagged his tail. "That's Rusty," Ethan explained, and she echoed the name as well. As the night wore on, Ethan tried to piece together her story. She couldn't speak his language but communicated through gestures. He pointed to the mysterious device, and her face tightened, her hands curling protectively around it. Her reaction told him it was important, maybe even dangerous. Outside, the wind howled, and Rusty's ears perked again. He let out a low growl. Ethan frowned, moving to the window. The woods were dark, but the faintest flicker of blue light pulsed in the distance. He turned to the girl, who was now standing, clutching the device tightly. "Someone's out there," Ethan muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. The girl nodded, her face pale with fear. Ethan grabbed the shotgun he kept by the door. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but if they're looking for you, they'll have to get through me first." The girl placed a hand on his arm, her luminous eyes locking onto his. She pointed to herself, then to the door, shaking her head. Ethan hesitated, understanding her silent plea. Whoever was out there wasn't just after her, they were dangerous. The chase through shadows. Ethan barely had time to think as the knock came, a sharp, deliberate rap on the cabin door. Rusty's growl deepened, his hackles raised like a warning beacon. The girl, still clutching the strange device, darted to Ethan's side, her movements graceful but panicked. She tugged his arm, shaking her head urgently, her other hand pointing toward the back door. The message was clear, they needed to leave. The knocking turned into pounding, the sound reverberating through the small cabin. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they weren't about to wait for an invitation. Ethan's grip tightened on his shotgun as adrenaline surged through him. He whispered to the girl, "We're going out the back. Stay close." Rusty barked sharply as Ethan unlatched the back door as quietly as he could. They slipped into the cold night, the girl's bare feet soundless against the dirt. Ethan kept the flashlight off, trusting the pale glow of the moon and his memory of the forest paths to guide them. They had barely made it 50 yards into the woods when a strange sound filled the air, a metallic hum that vibrated in Ethan's chest. He paused, turning to glance back at the cabin. Through the trees, he saw it, a beam of blue light scanning the cabin like a giant, unblinking eye. The door splintered under an unseen force, shattering inward with terrifying ease. "Run," Ethan hissed, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her into the deeper shadows of the forest. Rusty led the way, his instincts sharp and his pace relentless. The girl stumbled but kept moving, her grip on Ethan's hand surprisingly strong. The hum grew louder, joined now by mechanical whirs and clicks. Ethan risked a glance back and saw shapes moving through the trees, tall, humanoid figures with a metallic sheen. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, their eyes glowing faintly blue as they scanned the area. They were fast, closing the distance with unnerving precision. Ethan's mind raced. Whoever these pursuers were, they were advanced, far beyond anything he could comprehend. And yet, the girl had escaped them before. That meant there had to be a way. Rusty suddenly stopped, growling at a break in the trees ahead. Ethan crouched behind a large fallen log, pulling the girl down with him. She was breathing hard, her silvery hair catching the faint moonlight. Her eyes darted toward Ethan, then to the glowing device in her hands. She held it up, her expression pleading. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. "Can it stop them?" She nodded slowly but hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. She gestured toward the figures, then made an explosive motion with her hands. Ethan understood, the device could stop them, but it would come at a cost. The forest fell silent. Ethan peeked over the log, his heart pounding. The metallic figures had stopped moving, their glowing eyes scanning the area methodically. One tilted its head, as if listening, before emitting a sharp, mechanical chirp. The sound made Ethan's ears ring, but it was enough to give away their position. The figures turned in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto the log. One raised an arm, and a beam of blue energy sliced through the air, splintering a nearby tree. The girl gripped Ethan's arm tightly, her silent message clear, they couldn't run anymore. "Do it," Ethan whispered, his voice firm. "Whatever that thing does, use it." She hesitated for a moment longer, then pressed a sequence of buttons on the device. The hum of the machine changed pitch, growing louder and more erratic. The girl threw the device toward the figures, then grabbed Ethan and Rusty, pulling them further into the shadows. The explosion wasn't like anything Ethan had ever seen. It was silent at first, a flash of blinding blue light that seemed to swallow the world. Then came the shockwave, a burst of energy that flattened trees and sent debris flying. Ethan shielded the girl with his body, feeling the force ripple through him. When the light faded, the forest was eerily still. The metallic figures lay motionless, their once glowing eyes dark. The ground around them was scorched, the air thick with the smell of burning metal. Rusty whined softly, shaking off dust and debris. Ethan turned to the girl, who was slumped against a tree, her face pale but determined. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. But her expression didn't match his relief. She pointed back toward the destroyed figures, then up to the sky. Ethan followed her gaze. His heart sank. Above the treetops, faint blue lights began to appear, flickering like distant stars but growing brighter by the second. Reinforcements were coming. The girl struggled to her feet, her body trembling. Ethan caught her before she fell, her weight featherlight against him. "What now?" he asked, his voice laced with urgency. She reached into the folds of her shimmering garment, pulling out a second, smaller device. This one was more intricate, its surface etched with glowing symbols. She held it up, showing it to Ethan, her expression resolute. "Another weapon," he guessed. She shook her head and pointed to the sky, then to herself. The message was clear, it was a beacon, a way to call for help. Ethan's mind raced. If she had allies, there was hope. But if those lights reached them first, hope wouldn't matter. He nodded. "Do it. Call them." The girl activated the device, its glow pulsing rhythmically. Ethan turned back toward the forest, gripping his shotgun tightly. Rusty stood at his side, growling at the approaching lights. They didn't have much time. As the hum of the approaching machines grew louder, Ethan felt a strange calm wash over him. He had no idea what was coming, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going down without a fight. Signals in the dark. The rhythmic glow of the girl's beacon painted the dense forest in pulses of pale light, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan crouched low, his shotgun gripped tightly, while Rusty stood beside him, his growls low and steady. The girl, still trembling, held the device close to her chest, her wide, luminous eyes fixed on the sky above. The faint blue lights in the distance were now brighter, moving with an eerie precision through the night. They weren't just reinforcements, they were hunters, closing in on their prey. Ethan could hear the faint hum of their approach, a sound that set his teeth on edge. "What's the plan, lady?" he whispered, glancing at the girl. She responded with a quick series of gestures, pointing to the beacon, then to herself, and finally to the woods behind them. Her meaning was clear, the beacon was her last hope, but they needed to stay hidden until help arrived. Ethan nodded. "Fine. We'll buy some time." He motioned for Rusty to follow and whispered to the dog, "Stay sharp, boy." The group moved deeper into the forest, every step careful, every sound amplified in the tension-filled silence. Ethan's thoughts raced. Who, or what, would respond to the girl's call? And would they arrive before those metallic hunters found them? The hum grew louder, the air vibrating with its intensity. Ethan stopped abruptly, raising his hand. The girl froze behind him, clutching the beacon tightly. Rusty let out a low growl, his hackles rising as he stared into the darkness ahead. Ethan squinted, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. Then he saw it, a sleek, metallic drone hovering silently between the trees. Its blue lights scanned the area, sweeping back and forth like a searchlight. The thing moved with an unsettling grace, its glowing sensors darting in every direction. "Stay low," Ethan whispered, pulling the girl behind a fallen tree. Rusty crouched beside them, his growls replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The drone hovered closer, its hum intensifying. Ethan's fingers tightened on the shotgun's trigger. He knew a single blast wouldn't do much to the machine, but it might buy them a moment to escape. Beside him, the girl tapped his arm, shaking her head. She pointed to the beacon, then to herself again, urging patience. The drone lingered, its light sweeping dangerously close. Ethan held his breath, willing it to move on. For a moment, the air felt thick with anticipation, the only sound the faint pulse of the beacon in the girl's hands. Then, with a sudden mechanical chirp, the drone veered off, disappearing into the woods. Ethan exhaled shakily. That was too close, he muttered. But there was no time to celebrate. A distant sound reached his ears, metallic footsteps, steady and deliberate, growing louder with every passing second. The hunters were near. The girl tugged at his arm, her eyes pleading. She pointed to a large boulder ahead, its surface slick with moss. Ethan understood instantly. They needed higher ground. He nodded and gestured for Rusty to follow. Scrambling up the boulder, the three of them crouched low, hidden by the thick branches of a nearby tree. From their vantage point, they could see the hunters moving below, tall, humanoid figures encased in smooth, glowing armor. Their movements were unnervingly fluid, their glowing eyes scanning the forest with an almost predatory focus. Ethan's breath caught as one of them stopped directly beneath their hiding spot. The figure tilted its head, as if listening, before emitting a sharp, mechanical sound. The others responded in kind, their voices a strange symphony of clicks and hums. "What are they saying?" Ethan whispered to himself, glancing at the girl. Her face was pale, her expression grim. She made a quick motion with her hand, a cutting gesture across her throat. It wasn't hard to interpret, they were planning something deadly. As if to confirm her warning, one of the hunters raised its arm. A blue light flickered to life at its wrist, forming a blade of pure energy. The figure swung the blade effortlessly, slicing through a tree as if it were paper. The other hunters began moving again, their pace quickening. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The hunters would find them, beacon or not. He turned to the girl. "Is anyone coming for you? That thing you sent, will it work?" She nodded firmly, her grip on the beacon tightening. Then she pointed to the sky, where faint streaks of light were beginning to appear. Ethan squinted, hope sparking in his chest. Reinforcements? Allies? But hope was short-lived. The hunters below stopped abruptly, their heads snapping upward in unison. They had noticed the lights too. One of them emitted a harsh, grating sound, and the others immediately began to converge on the boulder. "They know," Ethan muttered. "Damn it." He stood, shotgun in hand, his jaw set. The girl reached for him, shaking her head frantically, but he waved her off. "We can't just wait for them to climb up here. Rusty and I will buy you time. When they come, you run. Got it?" The girl shook her head violently, tears welling in her luminous eyes. But Ethan didn't give her a choice. "Stay with her, boy," he whispered to Rusty before leaping down from the boulder. The hunters reacted instantly, their glowing eyes locking onto him. "Yeah, that's right," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Come and get me." He fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the forest. One of the hunters staggered back, its chest plate sparking, but it didn't fall. The others moved toward him, their movements swift and unrelenting. Ethan ran, weaving through the trees, drawing them away from the boulder. Behind him, he could hear the girl's beacon growing louder, its pulse now a steady, urgent rhythm. Help was coming, but would it arrive in time? As the hunters closed in, Ethan skidded to a halt, turning to face them. "Come on, you tin cans," he growled, raising his shotgun for another shot. Before he could fire, a brilliant light illuminated the forest. Ethan shielded his eyes as the air filled with a deafening hum. When he looked up, his breath caught. Descending from the sky was a massive craft, its sleek surface glowing with the same ethereal light as the girl's beacon. The hunters froze, their glowing eyes flickering uncertainly. Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the girl, her face lit with relief. She pointed to the craft, then to him, her expression clear. They were safe. For now. The arrival of the unknown. The immense craft hovered above the forest, casting everything below in a silvery light. Its presence was overwhelming, a mix of awe and fear that made Ethan's heart race. The trees swayed in the downdraft from its engines, their branches creaking under the force. The hum of the craft drowned out the mechanical movements of the hunters, who had stopped dead in their tracks. The girl, still clutching her beacon, stepped forward. Her pale features glowed in the light, her expression unreadable. Ethan grabbed her arm instinctively. "What are you doing? We don't know who's on that thing." She turned to him, her gaze steady, and placed a hand over his, as if to reassure him. She pointed to the craft, then to herself, and finally to the beacon. Her meaning was clear, this was the help she had called. The hunters didn't wait for confirmation. They raised their arms in unison, beams of blue light shooting toward the hovering ship. The craft responded instantly. Panels along its sleek surface shifted, revealing weapons that emitted bursts of white-hot energy. The beams collided mid-air, lighting up the forest in a blinding display of fire and sparks. Ethan shielded his eyes, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "Stay down," he yelled, pulling the girl behind a large boulder. Rusty barked furiously, standing guard beside them. The battle between the craft and the hunters escalated, each side unleashing a barrage of light and sound that shook the ground. Trees splintered and fell, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and wood. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was a battlefield now. Through the chaos, the girl stood resolute. She raised the beacon high, and it pulsed brighter than ever, sending out waves of light that seemed to ripple through the air. The craft responded immediately, its focus shifting. A hatch opened on its underside, and a beam of soft, golden light shot down, bathing the girl in its glow. Ethan's eyes widened as the girl began to levitate, the light lifting her off the ground. She turned to him, her expression filled with gratitude and sadness. She pointed to Ethan, then to Rusty, and finally to the woods behind them. Her message was unmistakable, they needed to leave. "No," Ethan said, standing. "I'm not leaving you." The girl shook her head, her silver hair flowing in the golden light. She gestured to the hunters, who were regrouping despite the craft's attacks. Their movements were more erratic now, desperate, but they were still a threat. One of them turned its glowing eyes toward Ethan and the girl, raising an arm. Ethan reacted on instinct, raising his shotgun and firing. The shot hit its mark, the hunter's chest plate shattering as it fell to the ground. But the victory was short-lived. Two more advanced, their glowing blades humming to life. The girl's beacon emitted a high-pitched sound, and the golden light around her intensified. She looked at Ethan one last time, her luminous eyes filled with an unspoken promise. Then she was pulled upward, disappearing into the craft. The hatch closed, and the craft began to ascend. But the hunters weren't giving up. They fired everything they had, their beams striking the ship's hull. Sparks flew, and the craft shuddered, its hum faltering for the first time. Ethan's heart sank. "Come on, get out of here," he muttered under his breath, as if willing the ship to escape. Rusty barked sharply, drawing Ethan's attention back to the forest. More hunters were emerging, their sleek forms glinting in the chaotic light. They moved with a terrifying precision, spreading out to flank him. Ethan backed up, his breath coming in short bursts. "This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad." Suddenly, the craft unleashed a final, powerful burst of energy. The light was blinding, forcing Ethan to shield his eyes. When it faded, the hunters were down, their forms lifeless and smoking on the forest floor. The craft hovered for a moment longer, then shot into the sky, disappearing in an instant. Ethan stood in stunned silence, the forest eerily quiet now. Rusty nudged his leg, whining softly. The girl was gone, and the craft was gone. But the danger wasn't over. The hunters' bodies began to emit a faint blue glow, their remains dissolving into the air like mist. Ethan stepped back, his pulse racing. "What the hell is this?" Rusty barked again, his eyes fixed on the ground where the girl's beacon had fallen. Ethan picked it up, the device still warm to the touch. Its glow had dimmed, but it was still active, pulsing faintly in his hands. Ethan looked up at the sky, then down at the beacon. "Guess we're not done yet," he muttered. He turned to Rusty, who wagged his tail, ready for whatever came next. Together, they began the trek back through the forest, the beacon clutched tightly in Ethan's hand. He didn't know what it would lead to, but one thing was certain, his quiet life was over. And the adventure was just beginning. Secrets beneath the surface. The trek back to the cabin was slow and tense. The forest, once vibrant and full of life, now felt like a hollow shell. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of burnt machinery and earth. Ethan clutched the faintly glowing beacon in his hand, its pulsing rhythm like a heartbeat, a reminder of everything that had just unfolded. Rusty walked beside him, his steps unusually quiet, his head constantly swiveling to scan their surroundings. The dog's instincts kept Ethan on edge. Whatever had attacked them wasn't just a passing threat, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. The cabin came into view, its once cozy silhouette now overshadowed by the memory of the hunter's assault. Ethan hesitated at the tree line, scanning the area. The porch light flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed untouched, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "All right, boy," Ethan muttered to Rusty. "Let's see what's next." Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of singed wood. The girl's presence was a lingering echo, her delicate footprints on the dusty floor, the blanket she had used still draped over the couch. Ethan set the beacon down on the table and sank into the armchair, his shotgun leaning against his knee. "What now?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. Rusty tilted his head, as if expecting Ethan to have the answer. The beacon pulsed again, its glow soft but insistent. Ethan leaned forward, examining it more closely. Its surface shimmered faintly, the etched symbols almost alive under the dim cabin light. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling. "You're important, aren't you?" "But why? And to who?" Suddenly, the device emitted a soft hum, startling him. The light grew brighter, and the symbols rearranged themselves, forming new patterns that flickered in rapid succession. Rusty barked sharply, and Ethan leaned back, his grip on the shotgun tightening. Then the beacon projected a small, translucent image into the air, a hologram of the girl. She appeared calm but resolute, her hands moving as though signing a message. The image lasted only a few seconds before vanishing, leaving Ethan stunned. "What the?" He stared at the beacon, his heart pounding. The girl had said something, or tried to, but he had no idea what it was. The beacon hummed again, and this time, the projection was different. It showed a map, though not of Earth. Ethan could see constellations he didn't recognize, lines connecting points of light like an alien star chart. One point pulsed brighter than the rest, drawing his attention. "Is this where she came from?" Ethan whispered. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl hadn't just left him a mysterious device, she had given him a destination. Rusty barked again, this time more urgently. Ethan turned to see the dog standing at the window, growling at the darkness outside. A shadow shifted among the trees, moving too fluidly to be natural. Ethan's blood ran cold. "They're back," he muttered, grabbing his shotgun. He snatched the beacon from the table and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. "Rusty, let's move." The two slipped out the back door, Ethan keeping his steps quiet despite the adrenaline pounding in his ears. The forest loomed around them, its shadows deeper and more menacing than before. Rusty led the way, his nose low to the ground, his tail stiff. The beacon pulsed again, this time faster. Ethan stopped, pulling it out. Its glow brightened, and the map projection reappeared. But now, one of the points on the map was flashing rapidly, its light almost frantic. "What are you trying to tell me?" Ethan muttered, his frustration mounting. The device hummed louder, and suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. Ethan stumbled, his flashlight swinging wildly as the vibrations grew stronger. Rusty barked and jumped back, his eyes wide. Then, without warning, the ground gave way. Ethan fell, the world spinning around him as dirt and roots tumbled in every direction. He landed hard on a cold, metallic surface, the air knocked from his lungs. Rusty yelped and slid down after him, landing at his side. Ethan groaned, pushing himself up. He blinked in the dim light, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. They were in a cavern, but it wasn't natural. The walls were smooth, lined with glowing panels that emitted a soft, blue light. Strange symbols and shapes pulsed along the surfaces, forming patterns that seemed alive. "What the hell is this place?" Ethan whispered. He reached for the beacon, which was glowing brighter than ever. The map projection reappeared, but this time, it expanded, revealing a three-dimensional layout of the cavern. At its center was a glowing core, pulsing in time with the beacon. Rusty barked sharply, drawing Ethan's attention. He turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, a humanoid shape, but unlike the hunters. This one was smaller, sleeker, and its movements were slower, almost deliberate. Ethan raised his shotgun, his voice firm. "Who's there?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing its metallic form. Unlike the hunters, it lacked weapons. Its body was smooth and reflective, its eyes glowing softly. It raised a hand in what looked like a gesture of peace. Ethan hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. The machine emitted a series of clicks and hums, its tone gentle and inquisitive. It gestured to the beacon in Ethan's hand, then pointed deeper into the cavern. "You know what this is," Ethan said, more to himself than the machine. The realization settled uneasily in his chest. This wasn't a random hiding place, it was a waypoint. A meeting ground. The machine gestured again, this time pointing to Ethan and Rusty, then to the glowing core on the map. Its message was clear: "Follow me." Ethan exchanged a glance with Rusty, whose ears were perked but whose tail wagged faintly. "You trust it?" Ethan asked the dog. Rusty let out a soft bark. Ethan sighed. "Guess we don't have much of a choice." Clutching the beacon, he followed the machine into the depths of the cavern, each step taking him closer to the core, and to answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. The core's whisper. The air grew colder as Ethan, Rusty, and the strange metallic guide moved deeper into the cavern. The blue glow from the walls pulsed in rhythm with the beacon, as though the entire place were alive, aware of their presence. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into the heart of something ancient and powerful, a place untouched by time. Rusty stayed close, his nose twitching at the metallic tang that hung in the air. The guide moved ahead, its sleek body reflecting the ambient light like liquid metal. Occasionally, it turned to glance at Ethan, its glowing eyes calm yet purposeful. It seemed to be leading them somewhere, but where? "Care to tell me what I'm walking into?" Ethan muttered, gripping the beacon tightly. The guide didn't respond, its clicks and hums now silent. The passage opened into a massive chamber, the walls stretching so high that Ethan couldn't see the ceiling. At the center of the room was a glowing core, suspended mid-air, its light radiating in slow, hypnotic waves. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, a swirling vortex of energy encased in an intricate lattice of metallic tendrils that seemed to pulse with life. Rusty growled softly, his ears pinned back. Ethan knelt beside him, patting his side. "Easy, boy. I don't think it's going to bite." The guide approached the core, raising a hand as if in reverence. The beacon in Ethan's hand began to vibrate, its light syncing with the core's pulses. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his boots echoing on the metallic floor. As he neared the core, a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, vibrating in his chest, in his bones. The beacon emitted a sharp burst of light, and suddenly, the swirling energy of the core shifted, coalescing into an image. It was the girl. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. She stood within the core's light, her expression calm but urgent. She raised her hand and pointed toward Ethan, then to the guide, and finally to the beacon. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. "What are you trying to say?" Ethan whispered, stepping closer. The image flickered, the girl's gestures growing faster, more frantic. She pointed upward, her face filled with desperation. Ethan followed her gaze, but all he saw was darkness. "Is something coming?" he asked aloud, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. The guide turned to him, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. It emitted a series of rapid clicks and hums, its tone sharp and insistent. Ethan didn't need to understand the language to know it was warning him. The ground beneath them trembled. Rusty barked, spinning in circles as the vibrations grew stronger. Dust and small debris fell from the unseen ceiling, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. Ethan spun around, shotgun at the ready. What now? From the passage they had come through, shadows began to flicker, tall, angular forms moving with unsettling precision. The hunters were back, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, raising his weapon. He fired at the first figure that emerged, the blast hitting its chest and sending it staggering back. But more were coming, their energy blades igniting with a chilling hum. The guide moved swiftly, placing itself between Ethan and the advancing hunters. Its metallic body shifted, panels sliding into place to form a shield. It emitted a high-pitched sound, and the core's light flared brightly, casting long, jagged shadows across the chamber. Ethan grabbed Rusty's collar, pulling him back. "We can't stay here," he shouted. But the guide turned to him, its gestures clear: "Protect the core at all costs." The hunters advanced, their movements relentless. One leapt toward the core, but the guide intercepted it, slamming the hunter into the ground with surprising force. Sparks flew as the two machines grappled, their metallic bodies screeching against each other. Ethan fired again, taking down another hunter. Rusty lunged at a third, his teeth sinking into its leg. The hunter stumbled, its energy blade slicing wildly through the air. "Good boy!" Ethan shouted, pulling Rusty back before the hunter could recover. The girl's image in the core grew brighter, her gestures more frantic. She pointed to the beacon, then to Ethan, and finally to the core itself. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what she was trying to say. "You want me to connect this thing?" he asked, holding up the beacon. The girl nodded, her expression pleading. Ethan hesitated for only a second before running toward the core. The heat from the core was intense, its energy making his skin prickle. He raised the beacon, its light syncing perfectly with the core's pulses. As he held it closer, tendrils of energy reached out, wrapping around the device. The moment the beacon connected, a shockwave burst from the core, sending Ethan sprawling backward. The hunters froze, their movements jerky and disoriented. The guide stood firm, its body shielding Ethan and Rusty from the blast. The core's light changed, shifting from blue to a brilliant gold. The girl's image stabilized, her gestures slowing. She pointed to the hunters, then clenched her fist. The core responded instantly. Tendrils of energy shot out, piercing the hunters one by one. Sparks erupted as their bodies collapsed, lifeless and still. Ethan sat up, his ears ringing. The guide helped him to his feet, its glowing eyes scanning him for injuries. Rusty barked, wagging his tail as if to say, "We did it." The core pulsed softly, its light dimming. The girl's image faded, but not before she smiled at Ethan, her expression one of gratitude and relief. Ethan stared at the now quiet core, the beacon still humming faintly in his hand. "What now?" he muttered, glancing at the guide. The machine gestured toward the far end of the chamber, where a new passage had opened. Ethan sighed, picking up his shotgun. "Guess we're not done yet, huh?" Rusty barked and trotted ahead, his tail wagging with newfound confidence. Ethan followed, the guide close behind. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: the answers were waiting, and he was finally ready to face them. The threshold of truth. Ethan followed the guide and Rusty through the newly revealed passage, the faint hum of the beacon steady in his hand. The air was different here, charged, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching their every step. The soft golden glow from the core chamber faded behind them, replaced by a pale blue light that seemed to ripple like water across the metallic surfaces. Rusty's ears twitched, and he let out a low growl. Ethan knelt beside him, patting his head. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, scanning the path ahead. The passage twisted into the unknown, its edges smooth and unnaturally perfect. The guide stopped suddenly, turning to Ethan. It raised a hand, signaling him to halt. The machine's glowing eyes flickered, and it emitted a series of rapid clicks and hums. Ethan frowned. "I don't understand. What's ahead?" The guide pointed toward the end of the passage, where the faint outline of a doorway shimmered in the blue light. Then, with deliberate slowness, it gestured to the beacon, then to Ethan's chest, and finally to the door. Ethan hesitated, gripping the beacon tighter. "You're saying I have to do something with this, there?" The guide nodded, its motions calm but insistent. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, Rusty staying close by his side. The door recognized their approach, sliding open with a soft hiss. Beyond it was a chamber unlike anything Ethan had encountered. A circular room with walls that seemed to pulse with a rhythm matching his own heartbeat. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it rested an orb of liquid light, constantly shifting and reforming. The beacon in Ethan's hand grew warmer, its vibrations intensifying. The orb responded, its surface rippling as though it were alive. Ethan stepped closer, his movements cautious. Rusty barked sharply, and Ethan froze. Behind him, the doorway began to seal, the guide standing on the other side. It let out a low hum, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. The machine raised its hand in what looked like a farewell gesture. "What are you doing?" Ethan shouted. "You're not coming in." The guide didn't answer. The door closed completely, leaving Ethan and Rusty alone with the pulsating orb. For a moment, the chamber was silent, save for the faint hum of the beacon. Ethan turned back to the pedestal, his mind racing. He held up the beacon, watching as the orb reacted, its light growing brighter. He stepped closer, and suddenly, the orb emitted a soft, melodic tone, a sound that filled the room with warmth and peace. Then, the room changed. The walls dissolved into a swirling tapestry of stars and galaxies, stretching endlessly in every direction. Ethan found himself standing in what felt like the heart of the universe. The orb floated upward, and the image of the girl appeared again, more vivid and real than ever. She spoke this time, her voice soft and melodic. Though he couldn't understand her language, the tone carried meaning. She gestured toward the stars around them, and suddenly, images began to form, memories, fragments of her story. Ethan saw a vibrant world bathed in silvery light, its people living in harmony with technology far beyond anything Earth had ever known. He saw towering structures of liquid metal, forests that glowed softly in the dark, and skies filled with shimmering vessels. Then the images darkened. A fleet of hostile ships tore through her planet's defenses, their designs jagged and menacing. The girl's people fought back, but they were overwhelmed. The final image was of the girl herself, escaping in a small craft as her world burned behind her. Ethan's throat tightened. "Your world, it's gone," he murmured. The girl nodded, her luminous eyes filled with sorrow. She pointed to the beacon, then to the stars, her expression resolute. The message was clear, the beacon was more than just a device, it was a key, a lifeline to rebuild what had been lost. Ethan shook his head. "Why me? I don't even understand any of this." The girl smiled faintly, pointing to his chest, then to Rusty, who wagged his tail despite the tension in the room. "Her meaning was simple, because you cared." Before Ethan could respond, the stars began to ripple, the image of the girl fading. The orb descended back to the pedestal, its light dimming. The beacon in Ethan's hand pulsed one final time, then went still. The room returned to its original form, and the door reopened. The guide stood waiting, its glowing eyes watching Ethan intently. Without a word, it gestured for him to follow. As they walked back through the passage, Ethan's mind swirled with questions. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Why had the girl entrusted him with something so monumental? And more importantly, would her enemies return? The guide led them back to the forest's edge, where dawn was breaking. The golden light of the rising sun cast long shadows across the trees. Rusty barked happily, trotting ahead as if the night's events had never happened. The guide stopped, turning to face Ethan. It reached out, placing a metallic hand on Ethan's shoulder. The touch was light but deliberate, a silent promise of trust. Then it stepped back, its body shimmering before it dissolved into the air, leaving Ethan and Rusty alone. Ethan stared at the empty space where the guide had stood, then down at the beacon in his hand. "Guess it's just us now, boy," he said, scratching Rusty's ears. The dog wagged his tail, his eyes bright with loyalty. Ethan sighed, looking up at the sky, where faint streaks of light still lingered from the departing craft. "Whatever this is," Ethan murmured, "I'll figure it out. For her." With that, he turned toward the horizon, Rusty trotting faithfully beside him. The forest seemed quieter now, the weight of the unknown heavier than ever. But Ethan felt a strange sense of purpose. His quiet life was over, but maybe, just maybe, it had all been leading to this. And somewhere, out in the stars, the next chapter of the journey awaited.